We will begin our journey with a beautiful song. It's a Bhojpuri song, one of my friend sent. So let me play the video. And I request a respected participant to mute themselves.
सभी सम्माननीय अतिथियों, पदाधिकारियों एवं श्रोताओं को मैं धनंजय मिश्र हार्दिक स्वागत, वंदन और अभिनंदन करता हूं। ये मेरे लिए परम सौभाग्य की बात है कि मैं आप सभी का स्वागत मैं अपने स्वरचित भोजपुरी गीत के माध्यम से करने जा रहा हूं। कैनी कृपा रउआ फेरनी नजरिया, स्वागत बरउर बार बार जी। कैनी कृपा रउआ फेरनी नजरिया, स्वागत बरउर बार बार जी। अखिया जुड़ाइल सबके हिया हर साइल, खन के लाधड़ कन के तार जी। स्वागत बरउर बार बार जी। कैनी कृपा रउआ फेरनी नजरिया, अइला से रउआ धड़कन धधाइल, सगरो सरे हवा खुशी से हरियराइल। मिलनी जे रउआ त धड़कन धधाइल, सगरो सरे हवा खुशी से हरियराइल। सगरो सिवनमा में फूलवा फुलाइल, गह 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 केला जवार जी। स्वागत बरउर बार बार जी। कैनी कृपा रउआ फेरनी नजरिया, स्वागत बरउर बार बार जी। स्वागत बरउर बार बार जी।
So thank you everybody for your kind attention. And one quotation of Martin Buber explained the whole feeling of this song, that we cannot avoid using power, cannot escape the compulsion to affect the world. So let us cautious indication and mighty in contradiction, love power fully. So with these words, I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, on behalf of School of Humanities and Social Sciences of Raffles University, I welcome you. I also welcome you on behalf of Swadhyaya Sahachkara, Circle for Creative Co-Learning, Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming, Puducherry and Chennai, Rage Global Foundation, USA. It's a joy and pleasure to have with us distinguished speaker, Professor Dr. O.D.J. Soltes. I also welcome Honorable Chief Justice, former Chief Justice of Rajasthan High Court, Dr. Justice Meena B. Bomber, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Raffles University, Professor Divakar Kohli, Deepika Dave, Chief of Rage Global Foundation USA, and Professor Anant Kumar Giri, Professor at Madras Institute of Developing Studies, and all the distinguished discussants, Professor Daniel Raveh, Tel Aviv University of Israel, Professor John Clammer, Jindal Global University Sonepat, and all the distinguished participants to this event. Let me give a brief introduction of our honorable speaker. Professor Dr. Soltes teaches at Georgetown University across a range of disciplines from art, history, and theology to philosophy and political history. He is the former director and curator of Beinai Kult's National Jewish Museum, where he curated over 80 exhibitions. He is also the author of over 230 books, articles, exhibitions, catalogs, and essays on range of the topics. Uh, Thank you so much, sir, for coming. Let me also give a brief introduction to our Sahachkara, co-learning circle of self and mutual studies, is an initiative of studying and learning together self, culture, societies, and the world. Friends associated with this are eager to walk and mediate with the new horizons of thinking and new movements of social and cultural change at work in our contemporary world. We study seekers such as Maharshi Aurobindo, Mahatma Gandhi, Chitranjan Das, a seeker and creative thinker from Odisha, and many others from around the world. We also present our own writings and reflect upon our creativity together. We also invite seekers from different fields of life to share with us their lives, vision, sadhana, and struggles for creating a world of beauty, dignity, and dialogues. We meet every Sunday or sometimes Wednesday. We are now nurturing this in collaboration with the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences of Raffles University and the Raise Global Foundation, USA. Today, it's a very great topic to discuss the work of Martin Buber, a great scholar, theologian, prophet of religious secularism and philosophy. Martin Buber is one of the 21st century's most influential thinkers. He believed the deepest reality of human life lies in the relationship between one being and another. One of the great insight which Martin Buber tells us is about God and the feeling of God. God is not in the heaven state, not on earth. God is not above, not below, not within and not without, not in the souls or in the flesh. God is not an entity anywhere. God is between I and thou. So with these words, now I would like to invite Professor Anant Kumar Giri sir to kindly moderate the session. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Randhir, and a warm welcome to our dear Professor Ori Soltes, to Professor Daniel Raveh, my dear and respected friend, who teaches at Tel Aviv University. And like Buber, he is also a peripatetic thinker across border. And we have been very blessed to have him as a friend and co-worker with India and Indic traditions of thinking. And Daniel would kindly enrich us in our this journey of understanding Martin Buber by bringing us insights with Ramachandra Gandhi and Daya Krishna, who in their unique ways also resonate with the spirit of dialogue that Martin Buber embodied. Another aspect of Buber's journey, which we read from Ori's very deep work, is Buber's work on mysticism and how Buber's journey with the Hasidic masters, the Hasidic tales, it was a journey of simultaneous enrichment, as Ori tells us that how, and that also had a very interesting cross-cultural moment. Ori tells us that how Martin Buber, growing up as a secular person, but in his study, philosophical study, coming in touch with the mystical streams in Hinduism and Buddhism, which then got an inspiration for him to discover the mystical streams in Judaism, mainly through Hasidism. And that also influenced his philosophy that we find in I and Thou. The translator, and of course, we are very deeply enriched by the enriching and insightful and kind co-presence of our dear and respected friend, Professor John Clammer, who also brings a deep journey with philosophy, anthropology, and cross-cultural dialogue. And to this dialogue, John would bring certain insights from Wittgenstein and Levinas also to help us understand Martin Buber in our present engagement with him. Now, the translator of Buber's I and Thou, Ronald Gregor Smith, he looks at I and Thou as a philosophical religious poem. He also makes a distinction between two kinds of mysticism, a kind of higher mysticism, and which really is concerned with the realization of God and the divine, and another kind of mysticism. So these two components of Buber's work, the dialogical component, which of course had a very interesting correspondence in Buber's social and political engagement, as we know, especially in our present moment of difficulties of dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians, as we are just coming out of a very difficult and bloodletting battle between Hamas and the state of Israel. Buber's commitment to peace and his critique of Zionism, which he was also an early participant. And it is very deeply inspiring to remember how can we work and meditate with Buber. The other thing is that this social and political engagement also grows out of Buber's simultaneous engagement with philosophy and sociology. I had a chance to meet several times one of Buber's last but very distinguished student who has influenced world sociology very deeply. He is none other than S.N. Eisenstadt. And Eisenstadt was telling me, as he would have told many people, I'm sure Professor John Clammer would have met with Professor Eisenstadt. Eisenstadt was also a student of Japanese civilization. So that dimension of Buber, sociology and philosophy, pointing to a cross-civilizational dialogue, which we need to build on at this moment, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and mysticism, and opening ourselves to varieties of border-crossing dialogues. As we are invited by this journey, we begin with this line that Martin Buber begins his book I and Thou from this. So waiting I have won from you the end, God's presence in each element. This is a line from Goethe. And as we all know, Buber in I and Thou, he looks at I-thou relationship as different from I and I-it relationship. He writes, for the I of the primary word I-thou is a different I from that of the primary word I-it. The primary word I-thou can only be spoken of with the whole being. The primary word I-it can never be spoken with the whole being. Again, here as we read this theme, now we are invited to ask this question, why is that the primary word I-it can never be spoken with the whole being? And here I remember Ramachandra Gandhi, and of course my dear friend Daniel would help us quite a lot. this book, I Am Thou, in which there is a very interesting chapter called Towards a Abrahamic Advaita in India. And of course, there he is developing that how the idea of Advaita can emerge out of dialogue between Hindus and Christian, Hindus and Islam. But I wish to bring that perspective of towards a Abrahamic Advaita as not only vis-a-vis dialogue among religions, but dialogue between I, thou, and I, it. I think Buber builds on as Buber works with the path of philosophical anthropology, but he builds on the twofold nature of the human. While the twofold nature of the human is a reality, but the twofold nature of the human also has a non-dual dimension. And this is something possibly we can learn in our dialogue with Indic traditions. As mysticism is an element, both Ramachandra Gandhi and Daya Krishna, and which our dear friend Daniel would help us to understand more, they embodied in their own work both this path of dialogue as well as an engagement with the mystical without boundaries. Ramachandra Gandhi, Sita's Kitchen, is also a very deep testament of the mystical. And that mystical also interacts with the historical in very creative sense. Similarly, Daya Krishna also embodied dialogue, his philosophical dialogue between the Sanskrit scholars and others. And, so therefore, the Boborian path of dialogue, we can understand it simultaneously with other seekers like Daya Krishna and Ramachandra Gandhi. But Daya Krishna, though he was a critical thinker, the mystical journey, in my humble, realization, is not totally absent from him. When we read his last essay on the Ruk Veda, and he looks at the last hymn of the Ruk Veda, Sam Gachadvam, Sam Badadvam, and he writes that the God to come that is described here, that let us walk together, let us speak together, let our mind grow together, Sambho Manasi Jayata. This God does not have a name, and this God is a God of togetherness, which is also a deeply mystical component. So with this, sharing, very initial sharing, so it is a joy for me and us to welcome Ori. And I request Ori to kindly help us around 35 to 40 minutes. And then after that, we would listen to Daniel, whom we look forward to being enriched from 15 to 20 minutes, and John 15 to 20 minutes. Then we would have a good half an hour or so for our mutual learning and thinking together. So, Uri, please.
That's better. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I suppose it's appropriate that we are speaking in universal time and universal space, given the topic. I will divide my remarks about Buber into 6 parts, and then I'll rest on the 7th, of course, like the 6 days of Genesis. First, just a few notes about his basic biography. He was born in Vienna into an Orthodox Jewish family. His family descended from a long line of rather prominent rabbis, and his grandfather in particular was a scholar of rabbinic literature, of Midrash and the like. He was born into this family in 1878 or so. His parents split up. He lived with his grandfather for a while. Eventually, he moved back to live with his father, and so grew up mainly in Lvov in Ukraine, but endured some personal crisis that caused him to break from traditional Judaism and become very secular. He began to read Kant and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, particularly the German philosophers. And in 1896, at the age of 18, he came to Vienna again to attend the university, where he studied philosophy, art history, philology. 2 years later, he became drawn to the Zionist movement, as Ananta mentioned. But interestingly, very quickly, he was drawn to its cultural, its spiritual, its social aspects, as opposed to its political aspect. I'll come back to that. The following year, he studied in Zurich in 1899, and that's where he met Paula Winkler, who was a Catholic, who eventually became his wife. She converted to Judaism in 1901. And if we fast forward a few years, he initially was a strong supporter of the German effort in World War I because he perceived it as in part a process of civilizing the Middle East, which is interesting, of course, both because he would eventually fall away from that perspective and because the war that was being fought largely because of oil in the Middle East was being fought between two parties, the Germans and the British. They're the key figures. Obviously, they each had allies who shared in common this sense of European superiority and saw them, or justified rather, their involvement in the Middle East as having to do with bringing civilization to it. Be all of that as it may, Buber eventually, after the war, became a professor, an honorary professor at the University of Frankfurt am Main in 1930. But 3 years later, in 1933, he left that position in protest as Hitler came to power. And 5 years later, in 1938, he left Germany, he left Europe altogether and went to Jerusalem in what was then Palestine, and took up a position at Hebrew University, which meant that at the age of 57, he was leaving behind everything that he understood culturally and intellectually. Europe, its civilization, Germany, which was perceived by the vast majority of European Jews as offering the apogee of European civilization, but which was now specifically devoted to eliminating the Jews, not only from Germany, but from existence. And now he goes to Jerusalem, a whole new language in literal and metaphorical terms, to be part of a process of rebuilding Judaism from the ground up, but in a very different way from how it had functioned over the previous 18 or 1900 years. Which brings me to my second issue, his Jewish identity. To repeat, he goes from being very Orthodox to being rather secular. That's his initial religious transformation. He becomes, however, involved in his 20s, as I said, and as Ananta pointed out, in Zionism, but with an interest, to repeat, in its social, its cultural, even its spiritual elements, rather than its political focus, which had been the focus of Theodor Herzl, the founding father of the Zionist movement, with whom Buber had very strong debates, in fact, over this sort of subject. And when in the aftermath of World War I, when the British, with the imprimatur of the League of Nations, took charge of the whole area of what was then called Palestine, and having chopped off the eastern 2/3 of it to create a new state, Transjordan at the time, and handing over its governance to non-Palestinian leadership that came from the kingdom of the Hejaz, what is now Saudi Arabia, the Hashemite leadership. What was left, the western third from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, in Buber's mind, should become a binational state. That was his vision. That's what he wrote about in the 20s. Again, we'll come back to that. With respect to his identity, again, his Jewish identity, from the perspective of spirituality, as I mentioned in what I sent, and as Ananta mentioned, at the university became very interested in Hinduism and Buddhism, both. And that led to an interest in mysticism, the notion of connecting or reconnecting oneself to God, or in pure Buddhist terms, a non-personified Brahman, is an idea that drew him to it, and drew him oddly to mysticism within his own formerly abandoned return to Jewish tradition. Because, of course, in mysticism, the goal of the mystic is essentially to do the same, to become one with the divine. Having done so, to improve the community of which one is part. So not surprisingly, particularly when in 1903 he became involved with the Hasidic movement, and I'll discuss that in a moment, he began between about 1906 and the beginning of World War I, 1914, to issue editions, produce texts on and from the Hasidic tradition, beginning that year, 1906, with the tales of Rabbi Nachman, a key figure, the grandson of the founding father, as it were, of the Hasidic movement. And 2 years later, 1908, in fact, tales of the Baal Shem Tov, who is the founder of that movement, which leads me to the third section of what I wanted to say. So to repeat, mysticism has two very important components to it that would come to find a way in Buber's thinking more broadly and not just with respect to his interest in Hasidism. One, that if the goal of the mystic is to seek oneness with the one, and in so doing to be able to return, as it were, from that state of being to the world at large and improve the community around it, it also lends itself rather naturally to a universalistic perspective. If I fill myself with God, to do that, I have to empty myself of self. And if I do that, I may realize that my notion that my form of religion is the only correct form of religion is not God speaking, but my ego, myself speaking. So mysticism doesn't have to, but it very naturally lends itself to that kind of perspective. Within the Jewish mystical tradition, there are essentially three phases of its history. There is the Merkava period, which is followed by the Kabbalah period, which is followed by Hasidism, Hasidut. So three kind of phases that build on each other. And in particular, late Kabbalah in the late 16th century, the teachings of Isaac Luria and Safed in what is the Galilee include, among other ideas, the notion of what in Hebrew is called Gilgul, metempsychosis, that the soul continues to be reborn and reborn and reborn until some final moment. Second, that the community that is engaged in the mystical process is obligated to devote itself to tikkun olam, to the improvement of the world. So again, if my goal is to be filled with godness, that's too selfish, it won't work. My goal has to be to do that for the purpose of being able to improve the world around me. And the community of Luria regarded itself as a community of, and the term they used in Hebrew was Hasidim, of pietists, those who were pious, centered around a figure who led them called a tzaddik, a righteous one. But the idea that Luria promoted is that tzaddik is understood to be someone who has a kind of closer connection than the rest of us to the divine, by virtue of which he can lead us. But that tzaddik, by definition, is not the guy who by himself is going to fix the community, much less the world. It requires the cooperation of the community of Hasidim. Everyone has to take an equal share of responsibility for improving the community and the world. And in Lurianic Kabbalah, there's a whole series of stages that one might go through in that process, but I don't want to get sidetracked by Lurianic Kabbalah. I simply point it out because it becomes a stepping off point for the next phase in Jewish mystical thinking, which is the phase of Hasidism, which became Buber's focus, in which, in Hasidism, the center of the community is a tzaddik, and the community calls itself Hasidim, hence the term Hasidism. The founding father, as it were, in the middle of the 18th century of the Hasidic movement up in Poland is the fellow best known by his nickname, the Baal Shem Tov, or this will be abbreviated as Besht. Baal Shem Tov in Hebrew means the master of the good name. And the notion that underlies that term or phrase is that the ineffable name of God the name that is known to nobody, the true name of God, since the time of the temple to the present moment, till the future messianic era, no one will know that name, but the tzaddik knows that name. That's what gives the tzaddik the inside track with being able to bridge God and ourselves. So the Baal Shem Tov, by his mastery of that name, and you understand, mastery doesn't mean control, it means knowledge of, is able to affect results that others cannot. And those results can be understood in very banal, everyday senses and in much more elevated senses. He is a bridge between the upper and lower reaches of the mystical enterprise, as Ananta also pointed out. And the interesting thing with respect to Buber's engagement with all of this is we don't get sermons from the Baal Shem Tov. We get tales about the Baal Shem Tov. We see how he lived his life, not how he preached. And we get certain ideas that revolve around him and his community to add to the vocabulary of Lurianic Kabbalah, two of which I call to your attention. One is the Hebrew word dveikut, which literally means to glue oneself, to stick oneself, to try to stick to God. And the other is kavanah, purpose, intention. So it's not enough that I pray. I have to pray with a real fervor. And what enters into this picture is the means of accessing God in Hasidism becomes not just prayer and certainly not just the study of the Torah. That's important, but I can access God if I'm an illiterate milkman, like Tevya in the Broadway Fiddler on the Roof musical, by my dveikut, by my kavanah, by music, by singing, as we heard, we were sung to this morning, this afternoon, this evening, before we began, by dancing, and not only by way of the words of formal prayer and the words of study. So it is about life lived with a constant sense of God's presence all around us, in everything around us, in all of creation. So it's a kind of religious existentialism in that on the one hand, it is fervently religious. On the other hand, the responsibility for the community around me and the world around me falls on my shoulders. I can't relegate that responsibility to God. Oh, God will take care of it. The Lord will provide. That's not the vision of Hasidism that Buber presents us with. And maybe not surprising.
At this juncture.
Well, let me just finish this, and then you can. I know what you need to do is to translate, but let me just finish one last thought, and then, which is simply that Buber takes up Hasidism intensely again after World War II. So the tales of the Hasidim are published by him. In 47 and 48, he republishes the tales of Rabbi Nachman in 1956. And that leads me to my next section, which connects me to his existentialism. But I'm going to let Ananta intervene for a moment first.
Thank you so much, Ori. And it is not so much as intervening, but interweaving. And thank you. And all dear friends, I wish to have your generosity to take 5 to 6 minutes to translate some of these thoughts to Odia, and some of our participants should be enriched by this translation. Now, amaro bhai bhoni mane aji amaro jo kathati padichi seta hochi Martin Buber ko samparke. Martin Buber ari jone gavira दार्शनिक थिले एवं जने गभीर जीवन अन्वेषी थिले तांकर जन्म हेतला आप माने जा सुनिथिबे 1878 रे वियना रे तापरे जीवन रो रास्ता पथरे केते बाट जाइछंती तापरे से पढिचंती आ दर्शन पढिचंती एवं एई भितरे से तांकर यूदी परंपरा भितर को प्रवेश करिचंती आ तापरे से ସେତେବେଳେ ଯେଉଁ ଜାୟନିଷ୍ଟ ମୁଭମେଣ୍ଟ ଆରମ୍ଭ ହେଉଥିଲା ଯେମିତି ପାଲେଷ୍ଟାଇନରେ ଯେଉଁ ଲୋକମାନେ ରହୁଥିଲେ ଆଉ ଜିଉସ୍ ମାନେ ଇହୁଦୀ ଲୋକମାନେ ସାରା ପୃଥିବୀରେ ବିଚ୍ଛିନ୍ନ ହେଇକି ଥିଲେ ବିଭିନ୍ନ ଜାଗାରେ ସେମାନେ କେମିତି ଏକତ୍ରିତ ହେବେ। ତାପରେ ଯେଉଁ ପ୍ରଥମ ବିଶ୍ୱଯୁଦ୍ଧ ହେଲା, ସେ ବିଶ୍ୱଯୁଦ୍ଧ ପରେ ଯେତେବେଳେ ବ୍ରିଟେନ ଏବଂ ଅନ୍ୟମାନେ ଆଉ ଜର୍ମାନ ଉପରେ ବିଜୟ ହାସଲ କଲେ, ସେତେବେଳେ ପାଲେଷ୍ଟାଇନଟା ଦୁଇ ଭାଗରେ ବିଭକ୍ତ ହେଇଗଲା। 2/3 ଟ୍ରାନ୍ସ ଜୋର୍ଡାନରେ ବଳୀଭୂତ ରହିଲା। ତାପରେ ଯେଉଁ ୱେଷ୍ଟର୍ଣ୍ଣ ପାର୍ଟଟା ଇତିମଧ୍ୟରେ ଜର୍ମାନୀରେ ହିଟଲର 1933 ମସିହାରେ ଆସିଲେ। ତା ପୂର୍ବରୁ ମାର୍ଟିନ ବୁበር ଫ୍ରାଙ୍କଫର୍ଟ ଫ୍ରାଙ୍କଫର୍ଟରେ ସେ ଦର୍ଶନର ଅନରାରୀ ଅଧ୍ୟାପକ ଥିଲେ। ଆଉ ହିଟଲର ଯେ ଆସିଲା ପରେ ଯେମିତି ଇହୁଦୀମାନଙ୍କୁ ପ୍ରଥମେ ବହୁତ ପ୍ରକାର ଡିସ୍କ୍ରିମିନେସନ ତାପରେ ଯେଉଁ ମାରିବା ଆରମ୍ଭ କଲେ, ତାର ଜଷ୍ଟ ପୂର୍ବରୁ 1938ରେ ସେ 57 ବର୍ଷ ବୟସରେ ଜେରୁଜେଲମକୁ ଆସିଲେ। ସେତେବେଳେ ଜେରୁଜେଲମରେ ହିବ୍ରୁ ୟୁନିଭର୍ସିଟି ଜେରୁଜେଲମ ଗଢ଼ି ଉଠୁଥିଲା। ସେଇଠି ସେ ଅଧ୍ୟାପନା ଆରମ୍ଭ କଲେ। ଓରି କହୁଛନ୍ତି ଯେ 57 ବର୍ଷ ବୟସରେ ସିଏ ଜର୍ମାନୀରେ ଏପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ସେ ୟୁରୋପରେ ଥିଲେ, ସବୁ କିଛି ଛାଡ଼ି ପୁଣି ସେ ଫେରି ଆସିଲେ ପାଲେଷ୍ଟାଇନକୁ। ପୁଣି ଫେରି ଆସିଲେ, ନୂତନ ଭାବରେ ଆସିଲେ ପାଲେଷ୍ଟାଇନକୁ। ଏବଂ ସେଠି ଆସି ଯେ କେମିତି ଯେଉଁ ଇହୁଦୀ ଧର୍ମ ଇହୁଦୀ ସଂସ୍କୃତି ତାକୁ କେମିତି ନୂଆ ଭାବରେ କରିହେବ ଆଉ ନୂଆ ଭାବରେ ତାକୁ ପୁନଃ ସର୍ଜନା କରିହେବ, ସେ ବିଷୟରେ ସେ ତାଙ୍କର ମନୋନିବେଶ କଲେ। ଇତିମଧ୍ୟରେ ସେ ଯେଉଁ ମିଷ୍ଟିକାଲ ଦିଗ ସବୁ ରହିଛି ଧର୍ମର, ଆଉ ତା ଭିତରେ ସେ ହିନ୍ଦୁଇଜମ ବୁଦ୍ଧିଜମ, ହିନ୍ଦୁ ଧର୍ମ ବୁଦ୍ଧ ଧର୍ମକୁ ଅଧ୍ୟୟନ କରି ଜିଉସ୍ ଧର୍ମର ଯେଉଁ ମିଷ୍ଟିକାଲ ଦିଗ ତା ଭିତରକୁ ସିଏ ପ୍ରବେଶ କଲେ। ଏବଂ ସେଥିରେ ଯେଉଁ ହାସିଡିମ୍ ଦିଗ ଉପରେ ସିଏ ତାଙ୍କର ଗବେଷଣା କଲେ। ଏବଂ ବିଶେଷ କରି ଜଣେ ରାବାଇ ଅଛନ୍ତି ବାଲସେମ୍ ଟପ୍, ତାଙ୍କ କଥା ସବୁ କହିଲେ। ଏବଂ ସେମାନେ ଏ ବାଲସେମ୍ ଟପ୍ଙ୍କର ଯେଉଁ ଶିକ୍ଷାଦାନର ପଦ୍ଧତି ଥିଲା ଗପ ମାଧ୍ୟମରେ, ଏବଂ ସେଇ ସବୁ ଗପମାନଙ୍କୁ ସିଏ ସଂଗ୍ରହ କଲେ ଏବଂ ତାକୁ ପ୍ରକାଶିତ କଲେ। ଏବଂ ଯେଉଁ କଥା ଆମର ବନ୍ଧୁ ଓରି ଆରଥର କହିଥିଲେ, ଏଇ ମିଷ୍ଟିସିଜମରେ ବିଶେଷ କରି ହାସିଡିକ୍ ମିଷ୍ଟିସିଜମର ମୂଳ କଥା ହେଉଛି ପୃଥିବୀଟା ଯେମିତି ଅଛି ତାକୁ କେମିତି ଆମେ ଭଗ୍ନ ଭଗ୍ନ ରହିଛି ତାକୁ କେମିତି ଆମକୁ ଏକତ୍ରିତ କରିବା ଏବଂ ତାକୁ କେମିତି ଆମେ ସେଥିପାଇଁ ଆମେ ରେସ୍ପନ୍ସିବଲ୍, ଆମେ ଦାୟିତ୍ୱବଦ୍ଧ। ତେଣୁ ଏପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ଏଠି କଥା କହିଛନ୍ତି। ଆଉ ମୁଁ ଅନୁରୋଧ କରୁଛି ମୋର ଭାଇ ଭଉଣୀମାନେ ଆପଣ ବହୁତ ଆଟେଣ୍ଟିଭଲି ଓରି ଯାହା କହିଛନ୍ତି ଶୁଣିବେ ଏବଂ ଏଥିରୁ ଆମେ ନିଶ୍ଚୟ କିଛି କିଛି ବୁଝିପାରିବା। So dear Ori, please.
So if Buber, if his first forays into becoming a scholar in the formal sense have to do with his focus on Hasidism, again between 1906 and 1914, and he largely returns to that in the 40s, 50s, late 40s, 50s, early 1960s. By the end of World War I, he has been drawn to existentialism, which is a perspective that sees the universe as mechanistic, not teleological. Telos is the Greek word for purpose or goal. The teleological view of the universe, as you all know, is that God has made it for a purpose. The mechanistic view is God at most made it and walked away. At least, or maybe I've reversed that, at least made it and walked away. At most, there is no God at all. It just happened, the explosion of a hydrogen atom, in which case the notion of human freedom, which appears to be so complete, because if there's no God looking over my shoulder, telling me how to be and what to do, then I have freedom. There is nothing that is predetermined. There is no God divinely imposing upon me commandments. And we see the beginnings of that kind of a discussion among the great German philosophers like Hegel, like Kant, like Nietzsche. And on the other hand, of course, one realizes that that sense of freedom brings with it the burden of responsibility. And this is what Kant, for example, wrestles with. Can I formulate an absolute moral code in the absence of a metaphysical superstructure. God sees everything. I can't. So can I ever come up with the formulation that is absolute? Buber, in a manner analogous to Kierkegaard, begins to think in existentialist terms, but toward the religious community that had been his first passion, the Hasidim. And he comes back to the Hasidic discussion, writing the theory of Hasidism, Hasidism and Modern Man in 1958, the origins and meaning of Hasidism in 1960, the tzaddik as the exemplar, to repeat, not as the theorist, the Hasidim as taking joint responsibility for improving the world around them. So his focus early and late on Hasidism ends up informed by his existentialist thinking, but it's a religious existentialist thinking. It's understanding human freedom, not divine imposition, but not God not being there, and a freedom that happily bears on its shoulders responsibility. Now, obviously, there's been a rather significant event between the time of his initial interest in Hasidism, his development of an interest in existentialism, and his late return to these discussions of Hasidism. And that, of course, is World War II and the Holocaust. And so, not surprisingly, he writes a work on good and evil in 1952, and I just want to read you two brief passages from the very end of the section called The Ways. Passage 1, which is the very end. How can an evil will exist when God exists? The abyss which is opened by this question stretches even more even more uncannily than the abyss of Job's question. Job, who suffers without ever knowing why he's suffering, who asks God why, and God's response is, who are you to ask? There are things that humans cannot fathom and understand, such as why the innocent suffer. Were you there when I put the heavens in motion? Do you know why the constellations are this way and not that way? Do you know where the sun comes from and the winds come from? So God's answer to Job is a non-answer answer. So the abyss which is opened by this question about evil opens up an abyss even more uncannily than the abyss of Job's question into the darkness of the divine mystery. Before this abyss, the interpreter of the Psalms that praise God stands silent. The second passage that precedes it by about 10 lines is this: is the way closed to the wicked? It is not closed from God's side. So we may continue the reflection of the Psalms, but it is closed from the side of the wicked themselves. For in distinction from the sinners, they do not wish to be able to turn. That is why their way peters out. So from God's perspective, those who are evil can always return to being good. Around the same time, in the very same year, he also writes a book called Eclipse of God, which is inspired by the problem the Holocaust creates, which is the problem of theodicy, the question of the justice of God. Theodicy coming from the Greek words theos, meaning God, and dike, meaning justice. How can the innocent suffer? How do you account for the frying in ovens of over 1 million children? And that theodicy question begins in the discussion of it by the 60s and 70s to yield an answer, which is that that's the wrong question. God didn't make gas chambers and ovens, humans did. So the question, therefore, is what are humans, not what is God? Where were humans when the innocent were suffering, not where was God? Which leads me to my fifth topic, which is that sandwiched between that interest in Hasidism early on, that return to a discussion of Hasidism later on, and discussion of good and evil, and discussion of God, whom he perceives not gone, but eclipsed by human action. And his interest in existentialism the masterwork of his universalist philosophy and theology, Ich und du, you, I and you, I and thou, is written in its first form in 1923. And although he did any number of subsequent editings, he never substantially changed what was his first product. And as Ananta pointed out, I and thou starts out by distinguishing two ways of being in the world, by way of two what he calls primary words, I, thou, I, it. I, thou, a kind of reciprocal calling way of being in the world. I recognize the I that is you, as you recognize the I that is I. I don't only think of you as a thou, and you don't only think of me as a thou. They can't be pulled apart. They're part of one continuum. It is non-reciprocal. You and everything else around me exist, as it were, from my perspective. I, thou is a dual perspective. I, thou is to be in relationship. It is to experience. I experience you. I experience the world, as opposed to I am in relationship with you. I, thou is boundless. It is bounded. I, thou is an engagement with the full being. It with the partial being. And Buber goes on to suggest that this can be felt on three different levels. There is, of course, the natural level, nature. So nature, I can have an I-thou relationship with a rock, with a tree, with a flower, with my dog, but it's nonverbal because the medium of interface is necessarily nonverbal. Secondly, of course, on a human level, where the primary instrument is language, and where I can enact my free will. Here's the existentialist core of this, my free will in order to engage. I choose. Will it be an I-thou relationship? Will it be an I-it experience? It's my will. It's not God imposing it on me. I choose for myself to be engaged in this full-fledged reciprocal calling of you as you call toward me. And that leads to the third level, which is spiritual, meaning without language, meaning something beyond physical nature around me. And there too, it's the existentialist side of him that says, it's my will that causes me to decide to engage this way in a full-fledged relationship. So God and nature, both engaged non-verbally, are the sandwich in the center of which is human-to-human interaction. But they're all of a seamless fullness. And we recognize his drawing from a kind of perspective that was first set forth in modern thought by Spinoza. Spinoza, who was not aware of Hinduism and Buddhism as far as I know, but who's thinking about the relationship between God and ourselves, is reminiscent in a very fundamental sense of the Buddhist idea that depersonifies God, its being, its isness, its Brahman with which I seek union, not something that is identified by the kind of name that might cause me to think of it as mine. So Spinoza says, let's not call it Deus, God, because he's writing in Latin. Let's call it natura, nature. People don't fight over nature, they fight over God. And he distinguishes two distinguishable indistinguishables. Natura, naturans, nature, naturing, essentially God. And natura, naturata, nature, natured, which is the world around us. So in other words, these are one and the same, and yet they're separate. And we recognize that what he's talking about is henotheism. Heno is the Greek word for one. Theos, again, God. Pan, everything. The one God in everything. This is also the way in which Buber represents Hasidism. Why is it that I can engage God by going out into the woods and by humming a tune and dancing, and not only in the synagogue or the house of study? Because God is in everything and is everywhere. This is not to be confused, you understand. with pantheism, where all the trees and all the rivers are gods and goddesses. It's the one God found in everything. Here's the key for Buber. How do I engage God? I'm an existentialist. I believe in a mechanistic universe. I don't believe in God. I'm a secularist. If I'm an existentialist, I recognize that I have the will, the freedom to believe and not just to do and to be. The will from Kant, from Hegel, from Nietzsche, to suspend my disbelief for that moment. And when I do that, the I thou reciprocity, my calling of God and God's calling of me, will meet. And part of what facilitates that is my engagement of my fellow humans and all of nature. A quote, every particular thou is a glimpse through to the eternal thou. By means of every particular thou, the primary word, I thou, addresses the eternal thou. So part of the mechanism for seeking and finding and calling to a God that reciprocally seeks and calls to me is through my I-thou relationship with others. I am limitless, part of 1,000 thous. From my contact with all else, I gain contact with God. God calls, it's reciprocal. We recognize this as a very mystical way of thinking. If you think, for example, well, of any of the mystical traditions, but let's just say Sufism, for example, and when you think of that developing from Rabi'a further forward, what Rabi'a and others then subsequently claim, Ibn Arabi, Rumi, you name it, is that the line is effaced when the mystic succeeds in being filled with God. The line is effaced between the lover and the beloved, mediated by love. So there are three elements: lover, love, beloved. But as I seek God, I am the lover seeking the beloved. God is seeking me. God is the lover. I'm the beloved. So this sense of reciprocity has different sources that feed into this existentialist work called I Thou, which leads me to my sixth and last section of what I want to say. Ananta asked for a few words about Heidegger and the relationship with Buber. When Buber came to Jerusalem, excuse me, in 1938, his first lectures were about Kant and Kant's question of what is humanity, what is man? And in this series of lectures, he was delivering critiques of Marx, Feuerbach, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Scheler, all of these great German philosophers who were part of an extended period that thought of itself as enlightened. The Enlightenment that began in the late 18th century and is continuing through the early 20th century, but now it's come up against Hitlerian Germany. How is that possible? How is it possible that the Germany of Feuerbach and Nietzsche and Heidegger becomes the Germany of Hitler? This is 1938 when he's giving these lectures. So clearly, the Enlightenment philosophers on their own have not figured out what humanity is. And again, if you think of Kant and his discussion of the categorical imperative and his desperate desire to find an absolute moral code in the absence of a metaphysical superstructure, we understand why it goes nowhere. So of all of the thinkers whom he critiques, obviously Heidegger is the only one who is his contemporary. All the others are earlier. Heidegger, who by 1938, when Buber had left and taken up residence in Jerusalem, was already clearly aiding and abetting and supporting the Nazi program. Most famously, as rector of the university, he had at Hitler's behest gotten rid of Husserl. Husserl was Heidegger's mentor, his teacher, and he came from Jewish background. He converted, he grew up as a Christian, but from a Hitlerian perspective, it's not religion, it's bloodline. So Heidegger threw Husserl, his mentor, his father figure, out, which probably led to Husserl's death. At least that was Buber's perspective. Buber would later view Heidegger as his philosophy being a philosophy of magic. That's the turn of phrase he used, because magic, as opposed to mysticism, is about trying to manipulate our reality to ends that you want, whether it's pulling a rabbit out of a hat or whether it's curing someone who is ill. It's active in the present, in the everyday use of that power in order to affect the results that you want. And so it's about manipulation, it's about power. And that's how he was seeing Heidegger. Heidegger, who, mind you, not only got rid of Husserl, but in his 1935 Introduction to Metaphysics, and keep that image, thank you, whoever, I assume that's Ananta put it up, because I'll refer to it in just a moment. Heidegger, who in his Introduction to Metaphysics justified Hitler's regime. So Heidegger, who had in 1927 published around the same time, a few years after Buber published I and Thou, he published Sein und Zeit, right? Being in Time. And let me tell you, it's much easier to read it in German than in the English translation, speaking as a native speaker of English. But I want to read you just one quick passage. This entity, which each of us is himself, and which includes inquiring as one of the possibilities of its being, we shall denote by the term Dasein. So the translator doesn't even try and translate it. If we are to formulate our question explicitly and transparently, we must first give a proper explication of an entity, Dasein, with regard to its being. Now you must understand that Da in German means there, and Sein in German means to be. So Dasein means, if I just simply translate it literally, it's being there. But what Heidegger's view, what Dasein is the extension of myself. Imagine me walking in the woods with a flashlight. And so the light illumines the path before me. But now imagine that flashlight as actually part of me, not as something I'm holding in my hand. If you can imagine that, you're having a sense of Dasein. So on the one hand, Dasein is very much about how I, myself, encounter, experience the world, try to make it intelligible. He does interestingly speak of Mitsein, being with. So he does bring up the idea of the responsibility of being with and understanding the other, but it is derived from myself. And there's no room for God in this discussion by Heidegger. So a fundamental pair of ways in which his thinking and Buber's thinking we can imagine is distinguished is that Buber is talking about I-thou reciprocity. It's not the kind of image that I gave you. It's the image of a complete going back and forth, a calling to and calling from both sides, as opposed to it coming from the one side, myself. And secondly, Buber and I and thou comes back to the possibility of God by way of using the existentialist sense of will and freedom to repeat, to suspend my disbelief for a moment. And in that moment, God's there. So the Heidegger view of being and the Buberian view of dialogue are in very key ways opposed, even though there are certain elements, obviously, that connect them together. For Heidegger, it's all anthropocentric. Human thought is what leads to truth. If there is a reappearance of the divine, his phrase, it's through human thought. Being attains its illumination through the destiny and the history of man. This as opposed to Buber's will to relationship with God. So what is the relationship between Heidegger and Buber on the ground? Because in Buber's initial writing about Heidegger, clearly he is not, shall we say, overly favorably disposed to this man who in his writing, in his thinking, and in his actions seems to be antithetical to everything about which Buber is thinking and writing and trying to be. And let me bring you back to the essay on good and evil that Buber would publish in 1952. Is the way then closed to the wicked? It is not closed from God's side. You remember I read. In his discussion of good and evil, Buber said, look, there are different kinds of evil or different stages. There's that which comes from decisionlessness. Adam and Eve Cain in slaying Abel, this is a function of I-itness. It's not being done with the whole being. Cain doesn't realize what he's doing when he does it. He's coming to realize what he did when God says, "What did you do?" And instead of saying, "Gosh, I don't know what I did," he lets go of the responsibility. I don't know where my brother is. Am I my brother's keeper? Adam and Eve are operating similarly in a kind of decisionless, well, if I touch it, nothing happens. Maybe I can eat it from that fruit. And it's only afterwards that they not only realize they've done something wrong, but of course don't take responsibility for it, do they? Adam says, "She made me do it." Eve says, "The serpent made me do it." That's one kind. The second kind is that which comes from a decision. The building of the Tower of Babel, again, elsewhere in Genesis, is about making the decision to do something. And in this case, it's humans seeing themselves as God. That's the way he interprets that story of the Tower of Babel. And what that leads to, and this is what's most fascinating in Buber's discussion of evil, it leads to human enslavement. I become a slave to the self. So what I thought was freedom, in fact, is a different kind of slavery. And in any case, in the end, he says, evil is an unfathomable mystery. We go back to Job and its offspring. There are questions we can't answer. All of which brings me to that picture that Ananta just had on the screen. If you can put it back up again. It was taken in 1957 when Buber went back to Europe to help organize a conference on language. And at this very plush castle provided for the purpose, 1,000 feet above Lake Constance, with the Alps at the background, Heidegger and Buber and others. So this is Heidegger, this is Buber, right front and center, were engaged in these long, long conversations. Clearly, Buber later writes about this kind of jocularly, saying, it must have been funny because apparently they're both about 5'2". They're both very short. He said it was like a pair of gnomes walking in the woods with overly large heads, because they'd be walking long walks, talking about each other. A warm relationship. What do they talk about? Apparently they talked about blame. They talked about atonement. They talked about forgiveness. They talked about the relationship between humanity and divinity. All those areas in which, both in terms of their lives and in terms of their writing, they seem to stand on irrevocably opposite sides. From Buber's perspective, that's not where they end up. They end up I, thou. The interesting thing is the conference that was being discussed on language never took place because a few months later, Buber's wife Paula died, and he withdrew from discussions about the conference, and then the whole thing never happened. But the conversation between Buber and Heidegger certainly did. And the nature of the warmness of the conversation clearly reflects what Buber is all about from beginning to end in his writing, in his thinking, and in his being in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ori. Toda Rova. Vielen Dank. And one would have spoken multiple languages. And Sukran, he must also have learned a bit of Arabic. And I will take a little time to translate it for some of our friends. Then we would continue discussion. ଆମର ଭାଇ ଭଉଣୀ ମାନେ ଆଉ ଇତିମଧ୍ୟରେ ପରି କହିଲେ ଯେ ବୁବରଙ୍କର ଯୋଉ ମୂଳ ଲେଖା ରଚନା କି ଆଇ ଆଣ୍ଡ ଦାଓ ସେଇଟା 1923 ମସିହାରେ ପ୍ରକାଶିତ ହେଇଥିଲା। ସେଇଥିରେ ସେ ଦୁଇ ପ୍ରକାର ସମ୍ପର୍କ କଥା କହୁଛନ୍ତି, ଆଇ ଆଣ୍ଡ ଦାଓ, ମୁଁ ଏବଂ ତୁମେ, ଏବଂ ଆଇ ଆଣ୍ଡ ଇଟ୍। ସେଇ ଯୋଉ ତୁମେଟି ମଣିଷ ମଣିଷ ଭିତରେ ଯୋଉ ତୁମେ ଅର୍ଥାତ୍ ସ୍ୱାମୀ ସ୍ତ୍ରୀ ମୁଁ ଏବଂ ତୁମେ, ସେଟା ଗୋଟେ ପାରସ୍ପରିକତାର ସମ୍ପର୍କ। ଆଇ ଆଣ୍ଡ ଇଟ୍, ମୁଁ ଏବଂ ଗୋଟେ ବସ୍ତୁ ଭିତରେ ସେ ରେସିପ୍ରୋସିଟି ନଥାଏ। ଯଦିଓ ବୁବର କହିଛନ୍ତି ଯେତେବେଳେ ଆମେ ଯାଉଛୁ, ଫୁଲ ଗଛଟିଏ ଦେଖୁଛୁ ବା ପ୍ରକୃତି ସହିତ ରହୁଛୁ, ତା ଭିତରେ ବି ଗୋଟେ ଆଇ ଏଣ୍ଡ ଦାଓ ରିଲେସନସିପ୍ ଗଢି ଉଠି ପାରେ, ଯୋଉଟା କେବଳ ଏକ ଭାଷାଗତ ପାରସ୍ପରିକତା ନୁହଁ। ତାପରେ ସେ ଯୋଉ କଥାଟି କହିଲେ ଭାରି ମହତ୍ୱପୂର୍ଣ୍ଣ କଥାଟି, ଯେ ବୁବର ତାଙ୍କର ଚିନ୍ତାରେ ଆଉ ସ୍ପିନୋଜା ଦ୍ୱାରା ପ୍ରଭାବିତ ହେଇଥିଲେ। ଆମେ ଜାଣିଥିବା ଆମର ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ସେ ମାର୍ଟିନ୍ ବୁବରଙ୍କୁ ଦେଖା କରିଥିଲେ ଜେରୁଜାଲମରେ, ଏବଂ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ମଧ୍ୟ ସ୍ପିନୋଜାଙ୍କୁ ଅଧ୍ୟୟନ କରିଥିଲେ। ଆପଣମାନେ ଚିତ୍ତ ଭାଇ ବୁବରଙ୍କ ସମ୍ପର୍କରେ ଯେଉଁ ସଂଳାପ ବିଷୟରେ ଲେଖିଛନ୍ତି ଏବଂ ସ୍ପିନୋଜା ବିଷୟରେ ଲେଖିଛନ୍ତି ତାକୁ ଅଧିକ ପଢ଼ିପାରିବେ। ତେଣୁ ଏଇ କଥାଟି ସେ କହିଲେ। ତେଣୁ ଏଇ ସହିତ ଯୋଉ ମିଷ୍ଟିକାଲ କଥା, ଯୋଉ ସୁଫିଜମ, ଆଉ ଗୋଟେ ବଡ଼ କଥା, ଯେତେବେଳେ ଆମେ ଆଧୁନିକ ମଣିଷମାନେ ଯେ ଭଗବାନଙ୍କୁ ସନ୍ଦେହ କରୁଛୁ, ଡିସବିଲିଭ, ଆମେ ବିଶ୍ୱାସ କରୁଛୁ, ତାକୁ ବେଳେବେଳେ ଟିକେ ତାକୁ ସସ୍ପେଣ୍ଡ କରିଦେଲେ, ଅର୍ଥାତ୍ ସେଇ ଡିସବିଲିଭକୁ ତା ଦ୍ୱାରା ପ୍ରଭାବିତ ନ ହେଇ ଟିକେ ଆମେ ରଖିଦେଲେ, ଆମେ ଭଗବାନଙ୍କର ସ୍ପର୍ଶଟା ପାଇପାରିବା। ତାପରେ ସେ ତାଙ୍କ ଶେଷ କଥାରେ ଗୋଟେ ଦାର୍ଶନିକ କଥାଟି କହିଛନ୍ତି। ଆପଣମାନେ ଶୁଣିଥିବେ ମାର୍ଟିନ୍ ହାଇଡିଗର ପ୍ରଖ୍ୟାତ ଦାର୍ଶନିକ, ଆଉ ସିଏ କାଣ୍ଟ ଆମର ବୁବର ଯେତେବେଳେ ଜେରୁଜାଲମକୁ ଆସିଲେ, ସେ ସେଠି ପ୍ରକୃତରେ ମଣିଷ କ'ଣ ସେଇ ବିଷୟରେ ସେ ଲେକ୍ଚର ମାନ ଦେଲେ। ସେଥିରେ କାଣ୍ଟ ଆଉ ଫେୟରବାକ୍, ନିଚେ, ଏବଂ ସେ ଦେଖିଲେ ଯେ ଏଇ ସବୁ ମଣିଷମାନଙ୍କ ବିଷୟରେ ଏତେ କଥା କହିଥିବା ବେଳେ ଯୋଉ ଜର୍ମାନୀରେ ଫେୟରବାକ୍ ଅଛନ୍ତି, ନିଚେ ଅଛନ୍ତି, ସେଇ ଜର୍ମାନୀ କେମିତି ହିଟଲରଙ୍କର ଜର୍ମାନୀ ହେଇଗଲା। ଆଉ ଏଇ ସବୁ କଥା ହାଇଡେଲଙ୍କର ଦର୍ଶନ ବିଷୟରେ ସେ ଅଧିକ କିଛି କହିଛନ୍ତି, କଥା ଆମେ ପରେ ଆଲୋଚନା କରିପାରିବା। ଆଉ ତାପରେ ଶେଷକୁ ଆଉ ହାଇଡିଗର ଏବଂ ମାର୍ଟିନ୍ ବୁବର ପରସ୍ପରଙ୍କୁ ଭେଟିଲେ, ଏବଂ ଏତେ ସବୁ ଆହ୍ୱାନ ଭିତରେ ଯୋଉ ନାତ୍ସି ମାନେ ଏତେ ଜୁହୁଦୀ ମାନଙ୍କୁ ମାରିଦେଲେ, ଏସବୁ ଭିତରେ ବି ବ୍ୟକ୍ତିଗତ ସ୍ତରରେ ମାର୍ଟିନ୍ ବୁବର ଏବଂ ମାର୍ଟିନ୍ ହାଇଡିଗର, ବିଶେଷ କରି ମାର୍ଟିନ୍ ବୁବର ଆଉ ମାର୍ଟିନ୍ ହାଇଡେଗରଙ୍କ ସହିତ ସଦା ସଂଳାପରତ ରହେ, ଏବଂ ସେଇଟା ହିଁ ହେଉଛି ବୁବରଙ୍କର ପଥ। ଆମେ ହୁଏତ ଅନେକ ଯାତନା ପାଇପାରିଥାଏ, ଆମର ମୁଁ ବ୍ୟକ୍ତିଗତ ଭାବରେ ଆମର ଜାତି ଗୋଟେ ନିଧନଗ୍ରସ୍ତ ହେଇଥିବା ବେଳେ ବି ମଧ୍ୟ ତାଙ୍କର ସଂଳାପର ହୃଦୟଟି ସବୁବେଳେ ଅନ୍ୟମାନଙ୍କ ପ୍ରତି ଉନ୍ମୋଚିତ ହୋଇ ରହିଥିଲା। ଆଉ so dear friends, now we will continue our conversation. So I invite Daniel, Professor Daniel Raveh, please to join and enrich us. Daniel, please.
Okay, can you hear me properly? Can you hear me okay, Ananta?
Yes.
Yes. So thank you, Ori, for this interesting talk, and thank you, Ananta, for this invitation. I wrote a short piece that I wish to read to you. The title is Martin Buber, Ramchandra Gandhi, Daya Krishna, Dialogue. Everyone today speaks of dialogue, on a self-other relationship in which the other is thou or you, not it, as in Buber, or a face-to-face relationship in which one feels a sense of responsibility toward the other, as in Levinas. Interestingly, Levinas thought through the Hebrew words acher, other, and achrayut, responsibility. The word achrayut, responsibility in Hebrew, includes the word other, acher. If we listen to language, in this case Hebrew, one's ethical obligation toward the other becomes clear. If according to Buber, what I should seek is a relation that is reciprocal, Hilary Putnam suggests in his book Jewish Philosophy as a Guide to Life from 2008, then Levinas stresses the asymmetry of the fundamental moral relation. I see myself obligated with respect to the other. Consequently, I'm infinitely more demanding of myself than of others. Before reciprocity must come ethics. Everyone speaks of dialogue, but very few are able to go beyond slogans and actually engage in a dialogue. It is not an easy task, since in order to engage in a dialogue, one has to step out of one's comfort zone, transcend one's 4 cubits and acknowledge the otherness of the other, rather than appropriating or rejecting her or his position. Appropriation and rejection are 2 sides of the same coin. Dialogue is something different. Acknowledging the other in her or his otherness is again a difficult thing to do, both psychologically and practically. One needs to learn new languages, to become acquainted with texts outside one's familiar canon, to give up privilege and authority, to appreciate other ways of seeing and thinking. Martin Buber is one of the few who does not merely speak of, but who also engages in a dialogue. And one of Buber's least known dialogues is his dialogue with Indian philosophy. Western philosophy, past and present, is hardly open to other thinking traditions. There are, of course, exceptions, but by and large, Western philosophy, like the West in general, is West-centric, namely believes that the sun rises in West Europe and sets in North America. Everything else is marginal or peripheral and cannot be considered as really philosophical. Buber's engagements with the so-called East occur in many of his writings. In his paper, Martin Buber in Asia, Maurice Friedman, Buber's biographer and the English translator of many of his writings, spotlights Buber's deep interest in Asian philosophies, especially Taoism and Zen Buddhism. This interest, according to Friedman, echoes in Buber's essays, The Teaching of the Tao from 1911, Daniel, Dialogues of Realization, 1913, The Spirit of Orient and Judaism, 1916, and China and Us, 1928, and his book, The Place of Hasidism, in the History of Religions from 1960. Friedman further highlights the Taoist influence on Buber's magnum opus, I and Thou. India, however, is hardly referred to in Friedman's account on Buber and quote unquote, the East. He does mention the meeting between Buber and Rabindranath Tagore in Darmstadt, Germany in 1921, and Buber's ambivalent approach to Advaita Vedanta in Daniel, Dialogues and Realization, and later in I and Thou. This ambivalence is twofold. First, with regard to the primacy of a beyond over the here and now in Advaita philosophy, as read by Buber. And second, with regard to the question of dualism, I-thou, versus non-dualism, Advaita. In the short time I have, I wish to focus briefly on Buber's dialogue with Indian philosophy through two of his texts, I and Thou, apropos the question of dualism or non-dualism, and his letter to Gandhi, the famous Mahatma, in which he argues against the universality of the principle of ahimsa, non-violence. I will start with the latter, namely with the letter. Buber's letter to Gandhi, composed in 1939, was a response to an article published by the Mahatma in his journal Harijan toward the end of 1938, where he expresses his views with regard to the Jews in Germany under the Nazi regime and speaks of the possibility of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, Israel. In a nutshell, he argues that the Jews in Europe should adopt his own Satyagraha approach, rooted in ahimsa, and he rejects the request for a national home, stating that, quote, like other peoples of the earth, the Jews should make that country their home, where they are born and where they earn their livelihood. My focus here is neither Gandhi's controversial comments, nor Buber's furious reaction. He refers to these comments as tragic-comic, but the universality of nonviolence, which Buber challenges. Buber's letter reveals close acquaintance with Gandhian terminology. He freely uses terms such as ahimsa and satyagraha, and argues that even though nonviolence is indeed preferable in most cases, there are borderline cases in which it is hardly effective. Such a case, he argues, is the Nazi regime. Are you not aware, Buber asks Gandhi sharply, of the burning of synagogues and scrolls of the law? Do you know or do you not know, Mahatma, what a concentration camp is like and what goes on there? Do you know of the torments in the concentration camp, of its methods of slow and quick slaughter? I cannot assume that you know of this. Drawing on the Bhagavad Gita, thus displaying again his acquaintance with Gandhi's world, Buber further writes, I'm skipping the quote because my time is very short. Buber evokes the same dilemma raised in the Mahabharata by Krishna. Does the protection of dharma, morality, necessitate, even if just in rare cases, instances of adharma, immorality? Can adharma in the service of dharma, or immorality for the protection of morality, or war for the restoration of peace become legitimate? Buber never received a reply from Gandhi for this letter, nor did Judah Leib Magnus, another Israeli philosopher who wrote to him around the same time, challenging the universality of Ahimsa with a different argument. Magnus's argument is different, but I cannot delve into Magnus's later. Shimon Lev, author of Soulmates, the story of Mahatma Gandhi and Herman Kallenbach, his Jewish friend in South Africa, a book from 2012, tells me that the letters of Buber and Magnus must have reached Sabramati Ashram, but for some reason were not read by Gandhi, who, when asked about them by Louis Fisher, Magnus's friend, could not remember these letters at all. However, Buber did receive a reply, a belated reply, Ananta, from Ramchandra Gandhi. Ramchandra Gandhi, or Ramu Bhai, as he was addressed by his peers. His years are in 1937, he passed away. He was born in 1937, passed away 2007. Ramu Bhai, the grandson of the Mahatma and one of the most creative philosophers in India in the second half of the 20th century. His magnus opus, published in 1984, is titled, I Am Thou. If Buber speaks of transforming the other from the third to the second person, namely from it, consisting of he and she, to thou or you, then Ramu Bhai suggests taking one more step toward the Advaitic, non-dualistic formulation, I am thou. Buber was not unaware of the Upanishadic notion of an all-encompassing Atman, or selfhood, that echoes in Ramu Bhai's title and the book at large. So immense was Buber's interest in Indian philosophy that in part 3 of I and Thou, Buber offers a short narration of the famous Chandogya Upanishad story about Indra, Virochana, and Prajapati, a story that some of the listeners here must know. But he rejects the Upanishadic standpoint, which advocates absorption, as he puts it, and instead declares that, quote, the reality of the everyday hour on earth with a streak of sun on a maple twig and the glimpse of the eternal thou is greater for us, unquote. Buber prefers the maple twig and you, a real you, not a tentative you, to be finally immersed and lost in me, just as I, tentative like you, will be reciprocally absorbed and molten in you, with you. I wish to say a few more words about the Advaitic position as interpreted by Ramu Bhai, and then a few more words on Buber's rejection of this position. We can try to decipher Ramu Bhai's phrase, I am thou, through one of his two main inspirations, namely Ramana Maharshi. The other inspiration, of course, is his grandfather, the Mahatma. The ambivalence between these two stellar figures, Ramana, a personification of the Upanishadic utterance, Upashanto ayam atmeti, silent is the Atman, symbolizing the precedence of the Atman, the selfhood beyond, the metaphysical, spiritual human core over everything worldly, and the Mahatma, an activist, world changer, a rare combination of politician and karma yogi, just like the ambivalence between Ramubhai's insistence on Advaita, non-duality on one hand, and on dialogue with the other, on the other hand, is one of the main trajectories of Ramubhai's writing, at least as I read him. But please remember that ambivalence or tension in a philosophical discourse is not something to be solved or resolved. Ambivalence makes philosophizing more interesting. Ramana's Advaitic position is conveyed by this couplet chanted at the Ramana ashram in Tiruvannamalai. Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Shiva Arunachala. And the next line goes, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Arunachala Shiva, Shiva Arunachala. This couplet is made of two identical stanzas, two that are one. Each stanza consists of two words, Arunachala and Shiva, two